We were just introduced to a new variable type called character, and now we know 5 different variable types. So the character variable type is a variable that holds an individual character. It needs to be set off by single quotes instead of the double quotes that we use for string, and it can only contain a single letter or symbol. Down below you can see that I have the format for char for character, then you have to name it, and you want to use a nice name that makes a lot of sense, so this is called first initial, and I'm saying it equal to the letter B, and those are single quotes around it, and then my semicolon at the end. So this variable field will now hold a capital B. To review the 5 variable types we know, these 2 have to do with some type of text. So we have strings and we have characters. These 2 have to do with digits. So we have integers, which are whole numbers, and doubles, which have a floating point or decimal point in them. And booleans can either be true or false. And don't forget, with booleans, it assumes true. So the way this one works, and it's only called neg just because I ran out of space, so don't think that's a really good variable name because it's not. But this is a boolean variable, and it's named neg for negative, and it's set equal to some value, so I'm calling that value n right now, being less than 0. So that means if I put in n of -3, then the test would end up saying, well, -3 is definitely less than 0, so that would put a true in the neg variable. Now, if I put a +3 in for n, no, it's not less than 0, so 3 would not be less than 0, so then it would just send false to this value, to this variable. So it's really, it assumes true unless you put an exclamation point in front of it, then it still assumes true, but it's going to take the opposite of what you think. But that's how the booleans work. So I think sometimes it's a little bit confusing. So you just know whatever's in there, if it's correct, if that is valid, then it's going to send true. And if it's not, if that condition does not hold true, then it's going to send false. Okay, so now we learned about some methods that work with characters. And earlier we learned about the math methods. So we had like math.py. And this one has to do, these ones have to do with the characters. And so what is really important to keep in mind when you're counting characters is the starting position is 0, which is very strange. So my first name is Beth, B is in position 0, and then E is in position 1, position 2 is T, and position 3 is H. So even though my name has 4 characters in it, the position starts at 0. So there are still 4, you can see that there's 4 boxes here, but that's why you have to be really careful when you're talking about where characters, the position of characters. So, and that comes into play with this new method which is called char at. So it's basically like, where's the character at? What position is it in? And it's going to extract the letters from a string, and we're going to say which position we want it to look at. So first thing I'm doing here is I am creating a variable, and it's a string variable called name, and I'm populating it with the word Beth, and I'm doing it all at once. Because it's a string, we use double quotes. So you can see over here, these gray boxes up here are going to represent the internal workings of the program, so things that are going to be held in the computer's memory. And this is representing the output screen, what I'm going to see in the end. So there's a lot of internal processing before I see anything. So now we're going to pop down to the next line of code because programs work very sequentially. And I'm creating a new variable, and this time it's a character type, and it's going to be called first initial. And I'm setting it equal to the name variable, the character at the name variable. So I'm saying basically what this line of code says. All right, for position 0 in the variable name, what character do you have there? So the character at 0 position in the name variable. So you can see when I do that, it first creates the variable and it puts the value of B in there because B is the starting one, and that's position 0. So I pop down to my next line of code. I'm going to print out my first initial, and because it's a character type, I know it's only going to be 1 letter, so the B prints on the screen. All right, so our next method that we learned about is length, and that returns the number of characters in a string. And I stress the word number because that means anytime you use the dot length, you have to make it an integer because numbers have to be an integer. And it can't be a double because there's no decimal points. It's either, it's whole number, so it has to be integer. So we start with our string variable name Beth. We pop down to our next line of code, so we're going to create a new variable called numLetters, and it's going to be equal to the length of the name variable. So it's the variable name dot, and then you have length for that method. Afterwards, you have to have the parentheses and then the semicolon. So it gets created here, numLetters, and it's holding the number 4 because there's 4 numbers. So we can even count 1, 2, 3, 4. You always want to test your code with something that you know well, and then you can try and break it later on by putting other things in there. But in the beginning, you want to test it with things you know. All right, so then we're going to do a print line, and we're going to print the number of letters, and that's an integer, so we should see a number, and 4 prints right out, and it just takes that figure right from the variable. All right, so what if you wanted to get the last letter in a word? So for that, you need to subtract 1 from the length. So it's a double-step process because you have to get the length, and then you have to subtract 1 from it. You can do it all in one line of code, but you really have to. There's 2 steps. So you might be wondering why, and that's because you have to go back to think about the length of the word. So Beth is 4 digits or 4 letters long, 4 characters long, but the position, the last position, is not position 3. There's nothing in the 4th position because we count starting at 0, which is an odd thing in programming. So then you have to really take the length minus 1 to get to 3, and that's where the last letter is actually held, and that's what I want. So we're going to look at how this looks, what this looks like in code. All right, so we want to obtain the last letter. So we're going to start, we're not going to start with the string variable because we already know about that. So we're going to start with the numLetters, which we did in the last exercise. So we're just getting the length of the string variable name. And so numLetters is 4, which we did last time. And now we're going to pop down and we're going to create a new variable, and it's a character last letter. And that's going to be equal to name character at. So it's going to say where is the character at in the name variable, and we're going to use numLetters, so that's the length minus 1. So that should be, so we know the length is 4 and we subtract 1 is 3, so what's in that 3rd position? That's the H, and it's correct because I know the last letter of my name. I pop down to print out the last letter, and H prints on the screen. All right, so what about using a while loop to select each character in a word? And they call that a traversal. So we're just using a loop just to do, we're going to take one at a time. We're going to visit each little tiny place, each little character. All right, so we're going to start, I'm calling it counter, and I'm setting the counter equal to 0. You could name it in the book, I think they name it index. And so I create that counter, and so here it is. We have this variable, it's called counter, and it's equal to 0 before I get to my loop. So now we're going to drop down to my loop here, and we're going to say, okay, well, is the counter less than the length of the name variable? And so we know from the prior example, and just because of space constraints I didn't put it here, but we know the length of Beth is 4. So is 0 less than 4? Yes, it is. And so because of that, you're going to drop down into the body of my while loop. And so now I'm going to set letter. I'm going to create a new variable named letter, and it's a character, so it's going to hold 1 digit, and it's going to say what character is at the 0 position in the name variable. So the 0 position is the first one, which is B. So it's going to create the variable letter, it's going to fill it with B, and because it knows, yep, B is in that first position, which is position 0. And then it's going to print out the letter, and it's going to do a print line, so that means it's going to print the B, and the carriage is going to return to the next line of code. So it's going to be all in a separate line. And the B prints, and I go down to my counter, and I'm going to add 1 to the counter. And so you have to do this whenever you have a loop. You need to increment or decrement. You need to change the counter, otherwise it'll be an infinite loop that you'll never get out of. So counter is 0, I add 1 to it, so now I'm at 1. I pop back up and I check my condition again. So is 1 less than 4? Yes, it is. So I go to the body of the code. Now I want to know, all right, what character is at the first position in the name variable? So that is E. Over here you can see that the field, the variable letter changed to E. And you can notice that we're using these same variables. We're changing the variables just like we learned last week we can do. We don't set them once, we set them once, and we can keep changing them. So then we're going to print the letter. So it's going to print E. And then we go down and our counter plus 1. So 1 plus 1 is 2. We pop back up. Is 2 less than 4? Yes. So we go into the body. And now we want to find out what character is at the second position. And that is the T, because it goes 0, 1, 2. So we fill the letter variable is now with a T. And we pop down and we're going to print the letter variable, which is populated with the value of T. So T prints, and go down to my next line of code, and my counter is going to increment by 1. So 2 plus 1 is 3. I pop back up, is 3 less than 4? Yes, it is. Back into the body of code. All right, which character is at position 3? H is at position 3. It populates over here. I go down to print the line. It prints the H. I pop down, and my counter is now going to be equal to the counter plus 1. So 3 plus 1 is 4. Counter is now 4. I go back up to my while loop. Is 4 less than 4? No. So now I have to get out of my while loop. And that's where this indentation helps me. So this curly brace lines up with the while, so I know I need to pop down past that curly brace outside of the loop. If there was any additional code, I would execute it. I have no additional code, so this would stop my program. My name printed out, all in a line. Okay, now how about incrementing or decrementing a counter? There's 2 different ways to do that. So I was using in that past code, I was using counter equals counter plus 1. I could also have used counter plus plus. They're the exact same thing. Either way, they mean the exact same thing. So to decrement or to go down, I could use counter equals counter minus 1, or I could use counter minus minus. So there was a problem in the book that said write a method that takes a string as an argument, so as a parameter. It's going to take that in as a parameter, and it's going to print the letters backwards all on one line. So we're going to go into NetBeans, and I've created that. So I'm going to show you what I have done. So this is my code, and I actually used the JOption pane because I wanted to practice using it. And I also like that it looks neater even though it's slower. So this is going to, in my main program, I did my string. I created a variable called word, and I set it equal to I'm using the JOption pane. I'm going to do an input dialog box. Going to set it equal to whatever the person types in, and so they can enter a word. It can be any word. And then I'm going to go down to this line of code, and it's going to say, oh, there's a method called backwards, and I'm going to send that word that we got from this user input down to it. So it's going to pop here, and so this backwards method says, okay, I need a string as an input, string variable as an input, and you're going to call it word here. This could be a different name because remember, variables are local. So if I created the variable called word up here, and if I didn't send it down as a parameter, I could not use the word in here. And I could change the name. It doesn't have to be word in here, but I like to use things that make sense, and so to me it makes sense. And this one, notice it says void here, and that's because there's no return. So I'm going to do all the print lines inside this method so I can keep it at void. And inside this new method, I've created 2 new integers. One's called the number of letters, and that's equal to the length of the variable word. So how long is word? It's going to count for me. It's going to put it into the thing called num letters, into the variable num letters. Then my next integer is going to be called counter, and that's going to be equal to num letters minus 1. And that's because we want to print the word backwards. So I want to start with the very last letter, and I need to know how many times to go through my while loop. And so I need to know how many how many positions I need. So that's why I'm getting that. And so here's my while loop, and I put a little space in there just so it's easier to read. Sometimes you can put some lines in there. So my while loop sort of stands out on its own. So I have the counter, which is really the num letters -1. So in my, let's say we're using my name Beth, so it would have 3 for the counter. And if 3 is greater than or equal to 0, then my code is going to execute. And that's because I know that there are 3 positions, and I'm going to use that to print out each character backwards. So then I created a new variable called character, or called a new character variable of character type, and it called it letter, and it's equal to which character is at the position in the counter. So that's going to be the last position. For the word Beth, it would be 3, whatever the last letter of the word is, and in this variable. So whatever the last letter is going to populate the letter field. And then we're going to go down to a print line, and we're just going to print that letter. And this is just print instead of print ln, and that's because they wanted in the example, what it said to do was to print them all on the same line. So, and then I go down and look, I'm doing the counter minus minus, so I did it the other way that I told you about. All right, so let's run this code. It just takes a minute for the window to appear. All right, so enter a word. I'm going to type coffee this time. Say OK, and it's EFOC. Oh, the other thing that I did was I just did a print line statement at the bottom. I don't like when the build successful is right next to my code. That bugs me. So, but since it was all printing on the same line and I was doing this while loop, I just decided that I would just do a print line statement in the end. So there's a few different ways to do that. And that is how you can print a word backwards.